when a hardened Civil War deserter accidentally traps a fleeing Apache woman in his snare. Both expect violence, but what happens next will challenge everything they believe about trust, survival, and love. In the frozen wilderness of 1881, two outcasts must choose between the hatred that defines their worlds or the impossible bond that could save them both. Welcome to a story that will take you deep into the untamed American frontier, where prejudice and compassion collide in ways you never imagined. I'm about to share with you a tale of unlikely connection that spans months of survival danger and ultimately transformation. Stay with me until the very end to discover how this forbidden relationship defies every expectation. And please comment with your city so I can see how far this incredible story travels across the globe. The morning air bit like broken glass against Wade Coulter's weathered face as he checked his trapline, each breath forming crystalline clouds that vanished into the October wilderness. 3 years had passed since he'd deserted from Fort Apache, 3 years of running from blue uniforms and sleepless nights haunted by his brother's dying screams. Now he lived like a ghost among the pines, setting snares for wolves and coyotes whose pelts might buy him another month of solitude. The mountains of eastern Arizona Territory stretched endlessly around him, painted in shades of amber and rust by the dying year. Snow had fallen early this season, dusting the high country in treacherous white that made every step uncertain. Wade moved through the forest with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that carelessness meant death, whether from Apache warriors, army patrols, or the dozen other ways these mountains could kill the unwary. His boots crunched through the frost-brittle undergrowth as he approached the 7th snare of his line, expecting to find it empty like the others. The rabbits had grown scarce, and even the wolves seemed to have abandoned this stretch of country. But as he crested the small ridge where he'd set the wire loop, Wade stopped dead in his tracks. Something was caught in his snare, but it wasn't an animal. A figure lay crumpled beneath a towering pine, one slender ankle held fast by the thin wire that had been meant for a wolf's leg. Long black hair spilled across the frozen ground like ink on paper, and Wade could see blood on the torn fabric of what had once been a doeskin dress. The figure wasn't moving. For a heartbeat, Wade's hand moved instinctively toward the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 years of isolation had honed his instincts to a razor's edge, and his first thought was ambush. Apache warriors were masters of deception, and more than one white man had died approaching what appeared to be a helpless victim. But as he studied the scene more carefully, details emerged that made him hesitate. The blood was real, too much of it to be faked. The way the body lay spoke of genuine exhaustion, not careful positioning. And there was something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat. The figure was small, too small to be a warrior. Wade circled downwind using every skill his years in these mountains had taught him. His pale blue eyes, bleached almost colorless by sun and hardship, scanned the surrounding forest for any sign of companions or weapons. The silence stretched taut as bowstring broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk. Nothing. If this was a trap, it was unlike any he'd encountered. Moving closer, Wade could see that his catch was a woman young, perhaps 20, with the high cheekbones and copper skin that marked her as Apache. Her face, even in unconsciousness, bore the classical beauty of her people, but it was marred by a fresh bruise along her left cheek and scratches that spoke of desperate flight through thorny brush. She wore the remnants of traditional Apache dress, but the garment had been torn nearly to ribbons. Her feet were bare and bleeding, cut by rocks and thorns during what must have been a frantic escape from what Wade had learned enough Apache customs during his time at Fort Apache to know that women didn't typically travel alone through these mountains, especially not in such condition. The wire of his snare had cut into her ankle, not deeply, but enough to draw blood. She must have been running in darkness or near darkness to have stumbled into it so completely. Wade knelt beside her, close enough now to hear her shallow, rapid breathing. She was alive, but barely conscious. Jesus. He whispered the word, emerging as a prayer rather than profanity. At the sound of his voice, the woman's eyes snapped open, dark as midnight and filled with terror so pure it struck Wade like a physical blow. She tried to scramble backward, but the snare held her fast, sending a fresh spike of pain through her injured ankle that made her gasp. "Please," she whispered in heavily accented English, her voice raw with fear and exhaustion. "Please, I have nothing. I have nothing to give." Wade raised his hands slowly, showing empty palms. "Easy there. I'm not going to hurt you." But his words seemed to have the opposite effect. The woman's eyes widened further, and she pressed herself back against the pine tree, as if she could disappear into its bark. You are, white man. You will—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Wade could see in her expression exactly what she expected him to do. The assumption hit him like a slap. He'd seen enough of frontier brutality to know why an Apache woman alone in the wilderness would fear any man, but especially a white man. Stories of what happened to captured Indian women circulated through every trading post and frontier town, told with varying degrees of shame or boasting, depending on the teller. "No," Wade said firmly, keeping his voice as gentle as his rough throat would allow. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you're caught in my snare and that ankle needs tending." He reached slowly toward the wire and she flinched as if he'd struck her. The terror in her eyes was absolute, primal, the look of a cornered animal that expected only death. "My name is Wade," he said, continuing to work at the snare with deliberate visible movements. "I'm going to cut this wire and then I'm going to help you get somewhere warm. You're half frozen." It was true. Despite the layer of buckskin, her lips had taken on a blue tinge, and violent shivers racked her frame. She'd been out in this cold far too long, probably running through the night without adequate clothing or shelter. The wire came free with a soft snap, and immediately the woman tried to stand. But her injured ankle wouldn't support her weight, and she collapsed back against the tree with a sharp cry of pain. Wade caught her arm instinctively, preventing her from falling completely. The moment his hand touched her skin, she went rigid as a board, her breathing becoming sharp and panicked. "I know you're scared," Wade said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I know you got every reason to be, but if you stay out here like this, you're going to die, and I won't let that happen." Something in his tone, perhaps the genuine regret that colored his words, made her look at him more closely. For the first time, her gaze met his directly, and Wade felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, not of her face, but of something deeper. He saw his own isolation reflected there, his own bone-deep weariness with running and hiding. What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind. "Sana." "Sana," Wade repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. "That's a pretty name. Sana, I've got a cabin about 2 miles from here. It's warm and I've got medical supplies. Food, you need all of that if you're going to live through the night." "Why?" The question came out sharp as a blade. "Why would you help me? I am Apache. I am—" She searched for the English word, then continued in a mix of languages that Wade only partially understood, but the self-loathing in her tone was universal. "Because you're hurt," Wade said simply. "Because it's the right thing to do." Sana stared at him as if he'd spoken in an alien tongue. In her world, in the world they both inhabited, kindness between enemies was not just rare, it was unthinkable. Apache and white settlers had been locked in brutal warfare for generations, each side viewing the other as something less than human. But here was this weathered white man with gentle hands and tired eyes offering her exactly what she needed most: sanctuary. "I cannot walk," she admitted, the words clearly costing her pride. "Then I'll carry you." Before she could protest, Wade slipped one arm under her knees and another behind her shoulders, lifting her with surprising gentleness for such a large man. She tensed again at the contact, but exhaustion was winning the battle against fear. As they moved through the forest toward his hidden cabin, Wade found himself acutely aware of the woman in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel the sharp edges of ribs that spoke of recent hunger. Her breathing had steadied somewhat, but every few minutes a violent shiver would run through her frame. "How long you been running?" he asked, as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. Sana was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "Finally, 3 days, maybe 4. Time becomes nothing when you run. Running from what?" Another long pause. "From my people. From what they would do to me." Wade wanted to ask more, but the haunted look in her eyes warned him off. Whatever had driven her to flee alone into the wilderness was clearly too painful to share with a stranger, especially a white stranger. The cabin materialized through the trees like something from a half-remembered dream. Wade had built it himself in a hidden valley that could only be accessed through a narrow gap between 2 towering rock formations. From the outside, it looked like little more than a hunting lodge, rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that rose only high enough to clear the tree-lined windows so small they barely qualified as such. But it was warm, dry, and invisible to casual observation. Most importantly, it was far enough from any established trail that Wade could go weeks without seeing another human soul. Smoke was already rising from the chimney he'd banked the fire before leaving that morning, a habit formed by 3 years of solitary living. The sight of it seemed to affect Sana powerfully. Her body relaxed fractionally in his arms, and for the first time since he'd found her, Wade heard her sigh. "Safe," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. Wade pushed through the heavy wooden door and into the cabin's single main room. The interior was spartanly furnished but meticulously clean. A small table and 2 chairs near the stone fireplace, a narrow bed built into one corner, shelves lined with supplies and books salvaged from his former life. Everything a man needed to survive and nothing more. The warmth hit them like a physical embrace, and Wade felt Sana's shivers intensify as her body began the painful process of thawing. He carried her to the single wooden chair closest to the fire and set her down with infinite care. "Let me get you some blankets," he said, but when he turned to go, her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. You will not leave me here." The question was full of barely controlled panic. Wade looked down at her small hand on his scarred wrist, surprised by the strength of her grip. "Just going to the chest over there. I'll be right back where you can see me." He moved slowly, keeping his actions visible and predictable. From a wooden chest beside his bed, he retrieved 2 heavy wool blankets, army issue, though he'd long since cut away the military markings. When he returned to Sana's side, she was staring into the fire with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Here," Wade said, draping the first blanket around her shoulders. The second he folded and placed beside her. This should help with the shivering. The improvement was immediate. Color began returning to her lips, and the violent tremors that had racked her frame started to subside. But Wade could see that her injuries needed attention before anything else. "I need to look at that ankle," he said, "and those cuts on your arms and face. I've got medical supplies." Sana's grip on the blanket tightened. I do not know your medicines. Apache healing is different." "I'm not talking about medicine, just cleaning the wounds so they don't fester, and maybe some bandages. Nothing you wouldn't do yourself if you had the supplies." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she gave a small nod. Wade retrieved his medical kit from a shelf near the fireplace. Another relic from his army days, though he'd supplemented it with supplies traded from various frontier settlements. The contents were basic but serviceable. Clean bandages, a bottle of whiskey for sterilizing wounds, needle and thread for more serious injuries. "This is going to hurt," he warned as he knelt beside her chair and gently examined her injured ankle. The snare had cut deeper than he'd first realized, leaving an angry red line around her ankle bone. It wasn't serious enough to cripple her, but it would need careful cleaning to prevent infection. As Wade worked, he found himself stealing glances at Sana's face, watching for signs of pain or fear. She bore the cleaning process with stoic silence, though he could see her hands gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles went white. When he finished wrapping the ankle in clean bandages, she released a breath he hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said simply. The words carried a weight that made Wade uncomfortable. In his experience, gratitude usually came with expectation strings that could bind a man or drag him down. But there was nothing calculating in Sana's expression, only genuine appreciation for basic human kindness. "You hungry?" Wade asked, changing the subject. "I've got some stew left from yesterday and coffee." At the mention of food, Sana's carefully controlled composure cracked slightly. He could see her swallow hard, her eyes betraying the hunger she'd been trying to hide. "I have not eaten since—" She paused, calculating. "Since before I began running." Wade ladled the still warm stew into a wooden bowl and poured coffee from the pot that lived permanently on the edge of his fireplace. The food was simple frontier fare venison potatoes, wild onions, but the aroma seemed to affect Sana almost as powerfully as the warmth had. She ate with careful restraint at first, as if afraid the food might be snatched away, but hunger won out over caution, and soon she was consuming the stew with an intensity that spoke of genuine desperation. Wade found himself oddly moved by the sight. When was the last time he'd shared a meal with another person? When had he last watched someone take comfort in something he'd provided? The isolation that had been his salvation was suddenly revealed as the prison it truly was. "More," he offered when she'd finished the bowl. Sana shook her head, though he could see the refusal cost her. "You have been too generous already. I've got plenty, and you need to rebuild your strength." As she ate a second smaller portion, Wade found himself studying her more closely in the firelight. The bruise on her cheek was fresh, perhaps a day old, and the scratches on her arms showed the characteristic pattern of someone who'd run through dense brush in darkness. But there were other marks, two older ones, that suggested a history of hardship. "You don't have to tell me," Wade said carefully, "but I'm curious what drove you to run alone into these mountains. Apache women don't typically travel without protection." Sana's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. For a moment, Wade thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. I was cursed. My people believe I bring death to those around me." She looked up at him with eyes full of old pain. "My husband died in battle. My child died of the fever. The elders said I was touched by evil spirits, that I must be sent away." The words hit Wade like physical blows. Exile from one's own people was perhaps the cruelest fate imaginable in this harsh country. To be cast out meant almost certain death, unless, like Wade himself, you possessed the skills and determination to survive alone. "So they just threw you out?" he asked. "The chief's son wanted me for his second wife. I refused. I could not bring my curse into his lodge, could not risk the lives of his children." Sana's voice grew bitter. "But he would not accept my refusal. He said I had no choice, that a cursed woman has no rights. When I ran, he sent warriors to bring me back." Understanding dawned on Wade like a cold sunrise. "The bruise on your face. From when they caught me the first time, I escaped again that night, but I know they still follow. They will not stop until—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Wade could fill in the blanks. "Well, they won't find you here," Wade said, with quiet conviction. "This place is hidden. I've been living here 3 years without being discovered." Sana looked around the cabin as if seeing it properly for the first time. "You also run from something." Wade was quiet for so long that Sana probably thought he wouldn't answer. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the trees like voices of the dead. "I was a soldier," he said finally. "Army cavalry stationed at Fort Apache. My younger brother served with me, Tommy. He was everything I wasn't. Brave, honest, believed in the cause. Believed we were bringing civilization to the frontier." Wade stared into the fire, seeing not flames, but memories too painful to examine directly. "We were part of a patrol that got ambushed in a canyon about 30 miles south of here. Apache warriors, maybe some from your band, maybe not. Doesn't matter now. They cut us to pieces. I watched Tommy die. Watched him beg for help while I hid behind a rock like a coward." Sana said nothing, but Wade could feel her attention like a physical presence. "I should have died with him. Should have at least tried to help. Instead, I played dead until the war party moved on, then ran. Deserted my post, abandoned my uniform, became exactly the kind of man I'd always despised." Wade's voice was flat matter-of-fact, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "Been running ever since." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the settling of logs in the fireplace. Wade expected judgment or pity, or the kind of empty reassurance that meant nothing. Instead, Sana simply nodded. "Sometimes running is the only choice left," she said. There was something in her tone, a recognition, an understanding that made Wade look at her more and more closely. In her dark eyes, he saw his own guilt and self-recrimination reflected back at him. Two people who believed themselves cursed, cast out from their respective worlds for sins, real and imagined. "Why did you help me?" Sana asked suddenly. "When you found me in your trap, you could have left me there, could have done other things. Why show kindness to your enemy?" Wade considered the question, surprised to realize he didn't have a ready answer. Why had he helped her? Simple human decency seemed inadequate, though it was part of the truth. There was something else, something he couldn't quite name. "Maybe because you reminded me that not everything in this world is about taking," he said slowly. "Or maybe because I'm tired of living like the dead." Sana pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, but her eyes never left his face. "Your brother, Tommy, what would he think of what you did today?" The question cut deeper than Wade expected. Tommy had always been the idealist, the one who saw good in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. What would he think of his older brother harboring an Apache woman, technically an enemy of the United States? He'd probably say, "I finally did something right," Wade admitted. As if summoned by his words, a new sound reached them through the cabin walls. The distant howl of a wolf answered by another from a different direction. The sound sent an unexpected chill through Wade, not because he feared wolves, but because it reminded him how exposed they were here. "You should get some rest," Wade said, rising from his chair. "Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." Sana shook her head firmly. "I cannot take your bed. I have already taken too much. You're hurt and exhausted. The bed is yours." "No." There was surprising steel in her voice. "I will not be more burden than I already am." Wade started to argue, then stopped. He recognized the pride in her refusal, the same stubborn independence that had kept him alive for 3 years of solitude. Pushing the issue would only make her more uncomfortable. "All right," he said, "but at least take the extra blankets. The floor by the fire is warmer anyway." As Sana arranged herself on the floor near the hearth, Wade banked the fire and prepared his own makeshift bed on the opposite side of the room. The domestic routine felt strange after so long alone, but not unpleasantly so. "Wade," Sana's voice came soft through the darkness. "Yeah. Tomorrow. What happens tomorrow?" Wade stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind and the distant wolves. It was a question he'd been avoiding, but one that demanded an answer. What did happen tomorrow? And the day after that, he couldn't keep an Apache woman indefinitely, could he? What were the risks, the complications? But looking at it practically, what were her alternatives? She couldn't return to her people, and she certainly couldn't survive alone in the wilderness, especially with winter coming. And Wade found himself reluctant to return to the suffocating isolation that had defined his existence. "Tomorrow we figure out how to keep you alive," he said finally. "Everything else we'll figure out as we go." He heard her shift on the floor, settling deeper into the blankets. "You are not what I expected from a white soldier. You're not what I expected from an Apache woman either." A soft sound that might have been laughter drifted across the darkened cabin. "Perhaps that is why we are both here in this place that exists between worlds." Between worlds. The phrase resonated with Wade in ways he couldn't fully articulate. That's exactly what this cabin had become, a space that existed outside the normal rules and boundaries of frontier life. A place where an army deserter and an exiled Apache woman could find common ground. As sleep began to claim him, Wade found himself thinking about Tommy for the first time in months, without the crushing weight of guilt. What would his brother think of this situation? Would he approve of offering sanctuary to someone who should by all rights be considered an enemy? But as consciousness faded, Wade realized that the categories of enemy and friend had become meaningless in the face of simple human need. Sana wasn't an Apache woman, and he wasn't a white soldier. They were just two people who had found each other in the wilderness, and sometimes that was enough. Outside, the wolves continued their haunting conversation, but within the cabin's log walls, two refugees from different worlds discovered something they'd both thought lost forever: the possibility of peace. The fire burned low but steady through the night, casting gentle light on the most unlikely of sanctuaries, a place where kindness had triumphed over fear, and where the first fragile threads of trust were being woven between two souls who had given up hope of ever finding understanding in a world that had cast them out. The first rays of dawn filtered through the cabin's small windows, casting pale golden light across the rough-hewn floor where Sana lay sleeping. Wade had been awake for nearly an hour, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest, awakening and watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing beneath the wool blankets. In sleep, the tension that had held her face rigid with fear and pain had finally relaxed, revealing the true beauty that hardship had tried to hide. Wade moved quietly, rebuilding the fire from the glowing coals and setting coffee to brew. The familiar morning routine felt different with another person in the cabin, less solitary, more purposeful. He found himself moving more carefully, trying not to wake her, and realized with surprise that he liked having someone to be considerate of. The aroma of brewing coffee finally stirred Sana from sleep. Wade watched her wake by degrees first, the subtle shift in breathing, then the flutter of eyelashes, and finally the moment when full consciousness returned, and with it memory. Her body tensed as she remembered where she was, and wide, dark eyes quickly scanning the cabin until they found Wade's reassuring presence. "Good morning," he said softly, keeping his voice low and unthreatening. Sana pushed herself up to a sitting position, wincing slightly as movement reminded her of yesterday's injuries. I thought perhaps it was a dream." "No dream. Coffee." She nodded, accepting the tin cup with both hands and breathing in the rich steam. Wade noticed that her hands were steadier this morning, though she still held herself with the careful wariness of prey that knew predators might be near. "How's the ankle?" Sana flexed her foot experimentally beneath the blanket. "Better. Your medicine bandages help much." "Good. You'll need to be able to move if—" Wade stopped himself, not wanting to voice the possibility that they might need to run, but Sana caught the unfinished thought. "You think they will find this place?" "I don't know. You said they were tracking you." "The chief's son, Nalnish, he is persistent and proud. To have a woman refuse him, especially a cursed woman, brings shame to his name. He will not stop searching until he finds me, or until—" She didn't finish, but Wade understood. until winter made the search impossible or until they assumed she was dead. Wade sipped his coffee thoughtfully. How good a tracker is he? Very good, but I was careful in the darkness, tried to hide my trail, and the snow from yesterday, it may have covered my tracks. Sana's voice held hope, but also doubt. This valley is hidden. The entrance is narrow and easy to miss if you don't know where to look. I've had army patrols pass within 100 yards without finding it. You sound like you have much experience hiding from searchers. Wade's laugh held no humor. 3 years' worth. The army doesn't take kindly to deserters, especially ones who know their patrol routes and supply schedules. They drank their coffee in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of the dangers they'd fled and the uncertain future that stretched ahead. Outside, the forest was coming alive with the sounds of morning bird calls, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the distant sound of water running over stone. I should check the area, Wade said finally. Make sure we don't have any unwelcome visitors nearby. Fear flickered across Sana's face. You will leave me here alone. Not for long, maybe an hour. I need to see if there are any signs of tracking parties, and I want to reset some of my warning snares on the approaches to this valley. Warning snares? Wade smiled grimly. Nothing deadly, just noisemakers that will tell me if someone's coming. Little strings of tin cans and pebbles hung where a man might pass without looking carefully. They've saved my life more than once. Sana nodded slowly. In my tribe, we use similar methods. Bent twigs disturb stones. The forest speaks to those who know how to listen. Exactly. Wade rose and began gathering his rifle and pack. I'll leave you the pistol. You know how to use one. My husband taught me before. She gestured vaguely, encompassing all the losses that had led to this moment. Wade handed her his spare revolver, a worn but reliable Colt that he kept as backup. 6 shots. Try not to need them. Wade. Her voice stopped him at the door. If you do not return, if something happens to you out there, I want you to know. What you have done for me, it is more than I dared hope for from anyone, white or Apache. The words hit Wade harder than he'd expected. When was the last time anyone had expressed genuine gratitude for his actions? When had anyone looked at him and seen something other than a coward or a failure? I'll be back, he said simply. I promise. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of pine-fallen leaves and the promise of more snow to come. Wade moved through the forest with practiced stealth, reading the signs that most men would miss entirely. Here, a broken branch where something large had passed. There, the faint impression of a moccasin print in soft earth beside a stream. But as he worked his way through the network of game trails and natural corridors that surrounded his hidden valley, Wade found no evidence of human pursuit. The tracks he discovered were all animal deer elk, the occasional bear preparing for winter's long sleep. Either Sana had successfully hidden her trail, or her pursuers had given up the search. Still, he took the time to reset his warning systems carefully, placing the noise-making devices where they would be triggered by anyone approaching the valley from the most likely directions. The work was tedious but necessary, each placement requiring careful consideration of wind patterns, animal movements, and the psychology of men moving through unfamiliar terrain. It was while he was adjusting a particularly sensitive arrangement of tin cans and fishing line that Wade heard the sound that made his blood freeze in his veins, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse, answered by another from a different direction. Riders, multiple riders, and they were moving in a pattern that suggested organized searching rather than casual travel. Wade crouched behind a fallen log, controlling his breathing and listening with every murmur of his being. The sounds were coming from the east, perhaps 2 miles away, but they seemed to be working methodically in his direction. He waited, counting heartbeats, until he heard what he'd been dreading. The sound of voices calling to each other in a language he recognized as Apache. They had found her trail. Somehow, despite the snow and her attempts at concealment, Naalnish and his warriors had tracked Sana to this area. They might not have found the hidden valley yet, but they were close enough that discovery was only a matter of time. Wade made his way back toward the cabin, with all the speed stealth would allow, his mind racing through options and possibilities. They could run, but where Sana was still injured, and winter was closing in fast. They could try to hide and wait out the search, but if the Apache were truly determined, they might camp in the area for days or even weeks. Or they could fight. Wade's jaw tightened at the thought. He was one man with limited ammunition against what sounded like at least 4 or 5 warriors. The odds were suicidal. When he slipped back through the cabin door, Sana took one look at his face and knew. "They have found me," she said. It wasn't a question. "They're close, maybe 2 miles east, working this direction in a search pattern. We've got maybe an hour before they find the valley entrance." Sana closed her eyes for a moment, and Wade could see her struggling with some internal decision. When she opened them again, her expression had hardened with resolve. "I will go to them," she said quietly. "I will surrender myself. There is no reason for you to die because of my troubles." "Like hell." The vehemence in Wade's voice surprised them both. "You think I'm going to let you walk out there and sacrifice yourself after everything you've been through?" "It is the only way. If I go willingly, perhaps Naalnish will be satisfied. Perhaps he will not search further." Wade shook his head firmly. "And what happens to you then? You said yourself he wouldn't take no for an answer." Sana's silence was answer enough. "We're not giving up," Wade said with finality. "There has to be another way." "What way? You cannot fight all of them, and I cannot run far with this ankle." Wade paced the small cabin like a caged wolf, his mind working furiously. The valley had only one entrance that he knew of, but the mountains were full of caves and hidden passages. There might be another way out, something he'd never bothered to explore because he'd never needed an escape route. "The back of the valley," he said suddenly. "There's a cliff face with what looks like a cave opening about 50 feet up. I never investigated it because I didn't need to, but if it goes through the mountain—" "It would be very dangerous," Sana said. "Cave systems in these mountains, they are treacherous, easy to become lost or trapped. More dangerous than staying here." Sana considered this, then shook her head. "No, not more dangerous than that." They gathered supplies quickly: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, extra blankets. Wade felt a pang of loss as he looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 3 years. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't be coming back to this place. The searchers would find it eventually, and once they did, it would never be safe again. "Take only what we can carry easily," Wade instructed as he rolled his few precious books into an oilcloth bundle. "If that cave system goes anywhere useful, we might be climbing and crawling for hours." Sana had fashioned a makeshift crutch from a piece of firewood and was testing her ability to walk with it. The improvised support helped, but Wade could see that rapid movement would still be difficult for her. "Can you make it to the cliff face?" he asked. "I will make it," she replied with quiet determination. "I have survived too much to die because of a twisted ankle." They slipped out of the cabin and into the forest, moving as quickly as Sana's injury would allow. Wade led them along a circuitous route that avoided the most obvious paths, using every trick his years as a fugitive had taught him. The sounds of the search party were growing closer. Now he could hear individual voices, the creak of saddle leather, the occasional snort of horses pushed hard. The back wall of the valley was a nearly vertical cliff of red sandstone, weathered by centuries of wind and water into a complex pattern of ledges, crevices, and caves. The opening Wade had spotted was indeed about 50 feet up, accessible only by a treacherous climb across loose rock and narrow handholds. There, Wade pointed to the dark opening in the cliff face. "Think you can make it?" Sana studied the route, her experienced eyes picking out the safest path. "Yes, but it will take time. Time we don't have much of." Even as he spoke, the sound of horses grew noticeably louder. The search party had found something, probably the valley entrance. They had minutes at most before discovery. Wade went first, testing each handhold and foothold before trusting his weight to it. The sandstone was solid in some places, crumbly and dangerous in others. More than once he felt rock break away under his grip, sending small avalanches of stone rattling down into the valley below. Sana followed with surprising agility despite her injured ankle. Her Apache upbringing had given her a natural comfort with climbing and heights that served her well now. She moved with careful precision, never rushing, and always making sure of each placement before shifting her weight. They were halfway to the cave opening when they heard voices in the valley below. "The cabin is here." The words were in Apache, but Wade caught enough to understand. "Fresh fire, still warm. Search everywhere," came another voice, deeper and carrying the authority of command. That would be Naalnish, Wade thought grimly. She cannot have gone far. Wade and Sana froze against the cliff face, barely breathing. From their position they could see down into the valley where mounted warriors were spreading out from the cabin in all directions. One of them, a tall man with the bearing of leadership, was examining the ground around the cabin door with intense concentration. "2 sets of tracks," the man called out in Apache. "One is hers, the other—" He paused, and Wade could see him studying the boot prints Wade had left in the soft earth. "The other is a white man's boot, large military style." A murmur of surprise and anger ran through the search party. Wade felt Sana tense beside him on the narrow ledge. "A soldier," one of the warriors called. "Perhaps. Or a settler." Nalnish's voice carried a note of cold fury. "It does not matter. He has taken what belongs to me, and he will pay the price for his theft." "What belongs to you?" Sana whispered so quietly that only Wade could hear. Even in their desperate situation, the casual assumption of ownership in Nalnish's words filled her with rage. Below them, the search had become more systematic. The warriors were following tracks, examining disturbed vegetation, checking every possible hiding place in the valley. It was only a matter of time before one of them looked up and spotted the climbers on the cliff face. "Keep moving," Wade breathed, slowly and quietly. The next 20 feet of climbing were the longest of Wade's life. Every movement seemed impossibly loud, every displaced pebble a potential death sentence. His muscles burned with the effort of controlled, silent movement, and sweat ran into his eyes, despite the cool mountain air. Finally, mercifully, his reaching hand found the edge of the cave opening. Wade pulled himself up and over, then immediately turned to help Sana complete the last few feet of the climb. She accepted his assistance without protest, recognizing that speed was now more important than pride. The cave opening was larger than it had appeared, from below roughly 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow their vision completely. Cool air flowed from the depths, carrying strange scents of minerals and underground water. "We need light," Wade whispered, fumbling in his pack for the oil lantern he'd thought to bring. "Wait," Sana's hand stopped him. "Listen." From below came the sound of excited voices. Wade crept to the cave mouth and peered down, his heart sinking at what he saw. One of the warriors had found something, probably the place where they'd begun their climb. The man was pointing up at the cliff face, gesturing animatedly as he explained his discovery to Nalnish. The chief's son studied the cliff with predatory intensity, his gaze moving methodically across the rock face. Wade pulled back from the opening just as those searching eyes reached the level of the cave mouth. "They know we're here," he whispered to Sana. "Can they follow?" Wade considered the climb they'd just completed. "Maybe. Depends how determined they are and how good they are at rock climbing." From below came Nalnish's voice, raised in command. "Ashki, you and Bidzi circle around and search for another way up. Hastian, remain here and watch the cave. If they try to come down, kill the white man and take the woman alive." "And if they go deeper into the cave," came a reply, "then we wait. Caves in these mountains are full of dead ends and false passages. They will either come out or the mountain will kill them for us. Wade felt Sana shudder beside him. The casual certainty in Nalnish's voice suggested he was willing to camp outside the cave indefinitely, if necessary. "Looks like we're going deeper," Wade said grimly. He lit the oil lantern with hands that were steadier than he felt. The flame cast dancing shadows on rough stone walls that stretched back into absolute darkness. The cave was clearly natural, carved by millennia of water flow, but it was larger and more complex than Wade had dared hope. "In my grandfather's stories," Sana said quietly as they gathered their supplies, "caves like this were sacred places, passages to the underworld or to the realm of the spirits. Let's hope your grandfather's spirits are feeling friendly today." They set off into the mountain's depths, the lantern casting a small bubble of light that revealed the cave's secrets one step at a time. The passage was wide enough to walk side by side, though the ceiling varied from barely head-high to cathedral-like spaces that vanished into darkness above. The floor was uneven but passable, worn smooth by ages of water flow. Here and there they passed side passages that branched off into the unknown, but Wade kept them moving straight back, hoping the main passage would lead to another exit. "How far do you think this goes?" Sana asked after they'd been walking for nearly an hour. "No way to tell. Could be 100 feet, could be miles." Wade paused to examine a formation where water had carved the rock into flowing organic shapes. "But it's definitely going somewhere. Feel that air current." Sana stopped and concentrated. There was indeed a slight movement of air through the passage, carrying scents that seemed different from the cave's stale atmosphere. "Fresh air," she said with hope in her voice. "Maybe, or maybe just air from another chamber, but it's something." They pressed on the monotonous rhythm of footsteps and the steady flicker of lantern light, creating a hypnotic effect. The cave seemed to exist outside normal time and space, a world unto itself, where the conflicts of the surface world couldn't reach. "Wade," Sana said during one of their rest stops, "what will we do if we find another way out? Where will we go?" It was a question Wade had been avoiding, but one that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Even if they escaped Nalnish and his warriors, what kind of life awaited them? They couldn't return to either of their former worlds, his as a deserter from the army, hers as an exile from her tribe. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe we head north, try to reach one of the mining towns, where nobody asks too many questions about a person's past." "And then what? You think they will welcome an Apache woman? Think they will not ask questions about why a white man travels with her?" Wade was quiet for a long moment. She was right, of course. The frontier was full of stories about white men who took Indian wives, and those stories rarely ended well for anyone involved. "Maybe we could say you're Mexican," he suggested. "Your English is good enough and in the right clothes." Sana's laugh was bitter. "Yes, I will pretend to be something I am not. Live a lie for the rest of my life, always afraid that someone will discover the truth. It might be the only way. Or maybe," Sana said quietly, "we find a place where it doesn't matter what we are, where two people can simply exist without the world demanding explanations." "You think such a place exists?" "I have to believe it does. Otherwise, what is the point of surviving?" The passage ahead of them began to narrow, forcing them to walk single file. Wade went first, holding the lantern high to illuminate the way. The walls closed in until they were barely wider than his shoulders, and for several anxious minutes he wondered if they would have to turn back. But then the passage opened again into a vast chamber that seemed to swallow their light entirely. The sound of their footsteps changed, becoming hollow and echoing in a way that spoke of enormous space above and around them. Wade held the lantern as high as possible, trying to gauge the size of the chamber they'd entered. The floor stretched away in all directions, disappearing into darkness. Somewhere in the distance they could hear the sound of running water. "Underground river," Wade said. "That might be our way out." They followed the sound of water across the chamber floor, which was littered with fallen rocks and mineral formations that looked like frozen waterfalls in the lantern light. The river, when they found it, was a disappointment, barely 2 feet wide and only inches deep, flowing through a channel carved in the cave floor. Too small for a boat, even if we had one, Wade observed. But rivers flow toward larger bodies of water, Sana pointed out. If we follow it, perhaps it will lead to a stream, then to a creek, then to something large enough to take us away from here. It was sound reasoning, and they had few other options. The alternative was to retrace their steps and try one of the side passages they'd passed, but that would take hours and might lead nowhere. They followed the underground river for what felt like miles, though. Wade suspected the winding passages and lack of normal reference points were playing tricks with their sense of distance. The cave system seemed to go on forever, branching and rejoining in a maze that would have been impossible to navigate without the river as a guide. The lantern oil was burning low when they finally saw it, a faint glow ahead that was unmistakably daylight. Wade's heart leaped with hope even as he cautioned himself against premature celebration. The light could be coming from a shaft that led nowhere, an opening too small to escape through. But as they drew closer, the light grew stronger, and they could feel the unmistakable touch of fresh air on their faces. The underground river disappeared into a crack in the cave wall, but ahead of them stretched a passage that was clearly leading toward the surface. The final 100 yards of cave passage was the steepest they'd encountered, sloping sharply upward toward the growing patch of daylight. Wade had to help Sana navigate the rough terrain, her injured ankle making the climbing difficult despite the makeshift crutch. And then suddenly they were outside. The cave mouth opened onto a narrow ledge halfway up the side of a mountain Wade didn't recognize. Below them stretched a valley he'd never seen before, green with pine and aspen, crossed by a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. "We made it," Sana breathed, and Wade could hear the wonder in her voice. They were alive, they were free, and they were together. It wasn't much of a foundation for a future, but it was more than either of them had dared hope for just hours earlier. Wade extinguished the lantern and carefully surveyed their new surroundings. The ledge was narrow but stable, and a game trail visible on the slope below suggested a way down to the valley floor. More importantly, there was no sign of pursuit, no smoke, no movement, no indication that Naalnish and his warriors had found another way around the mountain. "Think we lost them?" Sana asked. "For now, but Naalnish didn't strike me as the type to give up easy." "No," Sana agreed grimly. "He will not stop looking, but perhaps now we have time to truly disappear." As they carefully made their way down the mountain toward the valley floor, Wade found himself thinking about what Sana had said in the cave about finding a place where it didn't matter what they were. Was such a place possible? Could two people from different worlds really build something together in a land that seemed determined to keep them apart? He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in 3 years, Wade Coulter felt something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces as they reached the valley floor and began following the creek toward an uncertain but suddenly promising future. The creek led them through a landscape that seemed untouched by the conflicts raging across the territory. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches filtering the afternoon light into golden shafts that danced across the water's surface. Wade found himself walking closer to Sana than strictly necessary, drawn by an awareness of her presence that had nothing to do with protecting her, and everything to do with the way she moved through this wild country, as if she belonged to it. They had been following the water for nearly 2 hours when Sana suddenly stopped, her head tilted in the listening posture Wade had come to recognize. Her dark eyes scanned the forest around them with the intensity of a hunter reading sign. "What is it?" Wade asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. "Smoke," she said quietly. "Very faint, but there. Someone has a fire perhaps half a mile ahead." Wade tested the air himself, but caught nothing. Sana's senses, sharpened by a lifetime in the wilderness, were clearly more acute than his own. Could be hunters, trappers, could be anyone. Or it could be them. Sana's voice carried the weight of someone who had learned that every unknown represented potential danger. They approached the source of the smoke with extreme caution, using every bit of cover the forest provided. Wade felt his muscles tense as they drew closer, memories of ambushes and close calls flooding back from his army days. Beside him, Sana moved like a shadow, her injured ankle seemingly forgotten in the face of potential threat. The smell of wood smoke grew stronger as they crept through a stand of aspens, whose golden leaves rustled softly in the late afternoon breeze. Wade could hear voices now speaking in English, and felt a mixture of relief and new apprehension. Not Apache warriors, but that didn't necessarily mean safety. Peering through the undergrowth, Wade saw a small clearing beside the creek, where 3 men sat around a modest campfire. Their appearance marked them immediately as trouble, the kind of hard-faced drifters who lived on the margins of frontier society, taking what they could by guile or force. Their horses, ground-tied nearby, bore the mixed brands and rough condition that suggested animals acquired through questionable means. "Well, well," one of them was saying as he poked at the fire with a charred stick. "Didn't expect to see Apache sign this far north." Wade felt Sana stiffen beside him. The man speaking was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. His companions were cut from similar cloth, dangerous men who had chosen to live outside the law. "You sure it was Apache?" asked the second man, younger, but with the same predatory look in his eyes. "Moccasin tracks by the water, unshod pony prints. Either Apache or someone doing a damn good job pretending to be." The first man spat into the fire, making it hiss. "Worth investigating, I'd say. Indian scalps bring good money in Tucson, especially if they're fresh." Wade felt his blood turn cold. Scalp hunters, the lowest form of frontier vermin men who killed indiscriminately for bounty money, often taking the hair of innocent Mexican peasants when Apache scalps were scarce. "Might not be alone," the third man contributed. His voice was higher, nervous. "Could be a whole band moving through. Then we track careful, like see what we're dealing with. If it's just a few strays, well..." The leader grinned, showing teeth stained brown by tobacco. "Easy money." Wade began backing away, intending to lead Sana in a wide circle around the camp, but a dry branch snapped under his boot, with a sound that seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. All 3 men were on their feet instantly, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced speed. "Someone's out there," the leader hissed. "Could be whoever left those tracks," suggested the nervous one. "Only one way to find out." The leader's voice carried the authority of command. "Spread out. Whoever it is, they just made a big mistake." Wade and Sana found themselves in an impossible situation. The scalp hunters were between them and the easiest escape route, and the terrain behind them rose steeply toward impassable cliffs. They could try to fight, but 3 armed men against 1 rifle and a woman with an injured ankle were terrible odds. "This way," Sana whispered, touching Wade's arm and indicating a narrow game trail that led along the base of the cliff. They moved as quietly as possible, but the hunters were experienced trackers. Within minutes, Wade could hear them calling to each other as they picked up the trail. Fresh sign here, 2 of them moving east along the rocks. The pursuit began in earnest, a deadly game of cat and mouse through terrain that offered little concealment. Wade found himself thinking of Tommy, wondering if his brother would approve of the choice he was about to make. Because there was really only one choice: he couldn't outrun 3 mounted men while helping an injured woman, which meant he had to fight. "Sana," he said quietly as they paused behind a fallen log, "I want you to keep moving east along this trail. There's bound to be another way out of this canyon somewhere ahead." "What are you planning to do?" Wade checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. Buy you time to get away. No, the word came out flat and final. I will not run while you die for me. This isn't about dying, it's about living, and you can't live if we're both caught. Sana's dark eyes flashed with anger. Do you think me so weak, so helpless? I am Apache. I know how to fight. With what your ankle won't support you for running, and you've got one pistol against 3 rifles. Then we fight together or not at all. The sound of approaching voices ended their whispered argument. The hunters were close now, working methodically through the rocks and trees, calling encouragement to each other as they closed the distance. There, the leader's voice rang out triumphantly. By that dead tree, bullets began whining off the rocks around their hiding place, the sharp cracks of rifle fire echoing off the canyon walls. Wade returned fire, trying to make each shot count while conserving ammunition. His first bullet took the nervous hunter in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the undergrowth. "Bastard's got a rifle," the leader shouted. "Flank him on the left." But Sana had already moved, working her way through the rocks with surprising stealth despite her injury. Wade saw her emerge behind a boulder 20 yards from the hunter's position, the borrowed pistol steady in her grip. Her first shot caught the younger hunter in the leg, dropping him with a scream of pain and surprise. Her second shot forced the leader to dive for cover, disrupting his attempt to get a clear shot at Wade. "2 of them!" The wounded man on the ground was shouting. "The woman's got a gun!" The leader was bellowing orders, trying to coordinate his remaining effective fighter, but the ambush had turned into a confused melee with bullets flying in all directions. Wade used the confusion to move closer, working through the rocks until he had a clear shot at the man who was trying to flank Sana's position. The rifle bucked against his shoulder and the hunter pitched forward without a sound. 2 down, 1 to go. But the leader was no amateur. Instead of panicking, he used the momentary lull to assess the situation and adapt his tactics. Wade saw him moving through the trees with the fluid motion of someone who had survived many such encounters. "You might as well come out," the man called. "I got all day and plenty of ammunition." A bullet spanged off the rock inches from Wade's head, followed by another that forced him to duck low behind his cover. The hunter had found a position with good sight lines and was making the most of it. "Sana," Wade called. "Can you see him?" "Yes, but I cannot get a clear shot." The standoff stretched taut as a wire each side, waiting for the other to make a mistake. Wade could hear one of the wounded men groaning, but the sound was getting weaker. The nervous hunter had taken Wade's bullet in the chest, and from the sound of his breathing, he wouldn't last long. Minutes passed like hours. Wade's muscles cramped from holding the same position, and sweat ran into his eyes despite the cool mountain air. Somewhere in the forest, a jay scolded angrily at the intruders who had brought violence into his domain. The leader tried twice more to get a clear shot each attempt, forcing Wade to press himself flatter against the rocks. It was a war of attrition now, and Wade realized grimly that time was not on their side. Other travelers might come along this trail, or the sounds of gunfire might attract unwanted attention from various directions. Then Sana did something that stopped Wade's heart for a full beat. She stepped out from behind her cover, moving with deliberate slowness into the open space beside the creek. "Do not shoot," she called out in clear, carrying English. "I surrender." "Sana, no." Wade's shout echoed off the canyon walls. But the Apache woman continued walking toward the hunter's position, her hands raised but still holding the pistol loosely. Wade could see the leader emerging from his cover rifle, trained on her approaching figure. "That's real smart, girl," the man called bass. "Now drop that pistol and keep coming." Sana let the weapon fall to the ground with a metallic clatter. She kept walking, her movements hypnotic in their steady rhythm. The hunter's attention was completely focused on her, now his rifle tracking her progress, which was exactly what she'd intended. Wade had a clear shot at the distracted hunter for perhaps 3 seconds. He made it count, the heavy rifle bullet taking the man's center mass and dropping him beside his wounded companions. The sudden silence after the gunfire seemed unnatural, broken only by the sound of running water and the labored breathing of dying men. Wade emerged from his hiding place, rifle ready, but there was no more fight left in the scalp hunters. Sana walked back to retrieve the dropped pistol, her face pale but composed. "Are they all dead?" Wade checked each man carefully. 2 were already gone, and the third, the nervous one who'd taken Wade's first shot, was unconscious and unlikely to survive the hour. "Close enough," Wade said grimly. "Question is, what do we do now? We take what we need and leave this place." Sana replied practically. "These men, others will come looking for them eventually." They gathered supplies from the hunters' camp, ammunition, food, a better rifle to replace Wade's aging weapon, and most importantly, the 3 horses. The animals were in poor condition, clearly pushed hard and cared for minimally, but they would serve. "You can ride?" Wade asked as he adjusted stirrups on the best of the 3 mounts. "Apache children learn to ride before they can walk properly," Sana replied with the ghost of a smile. "This ankle will not prevent me from staying on a horse." They rode out of the canyon as the sun was setting, leading the 3rd horse as a pack animal. Wade felt no remorse for the dead men's scalp hunters had forfeited any claim to mercy long ago. But the encounter had driven home the reality of their situation. They were fugitives in a land that offered no sanctuary, hunted by forces from multiple directions. "Where do we go now?" Sana asked as they picked their way through the gathering darkness. Wade had been thinking about that question since they'd mounted up. North meant mining country towns full of rough men who would ask uncomfortable questions about a white man traveling with an Indian woman. South led back toward Apache territory and Naalnish's vengeance. East took them toward the settlements along the Rio Grande, where army patrols would be looking for deserters. "West," he said finally, "toward California. It's a long ride, but there are places out there where a person can disappear completely if they're careful." California. Sana tested the word as if it were foreign. "I have heard stories of that land. They say it is a place where gold flows like water and men become rich overnight." "Some do, most don't. But it's also a place where nobody much cares what you used to be, as long as you can work and keep your troubles to yourself." They made camp that night in a hidden grove beside a small stream building, no fire, and taking turns at watch. Wade found himself studying Sana's face in the starlight, marveling at the calm competence she'd shown during the fight. She had saved his life back there, drawing the hunter's attention at considerable risk to herself. "Why did you do it?" he asked during his watch shift. "Step out into the open like that. You could have been killed." Sana was quiet for so long he thought she might have fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "In my tribe, we believe that some debts can only be repaid with life itself. You saved me from the snare, gave me shelter, protected me from those who would harm me. Today, I had the chance to repay that debt. You don't owe me anything. Perhaps not in your way of thinking, but in mine." She shifted in her blankets, turning to look at him more directly. "Wade, what kind of man risks everything for a stranger? What kind of man shows kindness to his supposed enemy?" Wade stared up at the stars scattered like diamonds across the vast western sky. Maybe the kind who's tired of being alone. The honesty of his own words surprised him. When had he admitted to himself how much the isolation had cost him? When had he acknowledged that survival without connection was really just a slow form of dying? "I understand loneliness," Sana said softly. "Among my people, to be cursed is to be cut off from all that gives life meaning, to exist but not truly live. And now I am still cursed, still exiled, but I am not alone." They rode hard the next day, putting distance between themselves and the canyon where 3 men lay dead. The country they traveled through was spectacular, high mesas and deep canyons, forests of pine and aspen giving way to red rock formations that seemed carved by the hands of gods. But Wade was too focused on watching for pursuit to appreciate the beauty. It was late in the afternoon when they saw the smoke rising from a hidden valley ahead, not the thin wisp of a campfire, but the thick black column that meant them burning buildings. "Trouble," Wade muttered, reining in his horse. They approached carefully, using the same tactics that had served them well with the scalp hunters. But what they found in the valley was not an active fight, but the aftermath of one. A small ranch had been built beside a spring-fed creek, and someone had burned it to the ground. The main house was a smoking ruin, its log walls collapsed inward on themselves. The barn had fared better with only one wall destroyed, but the corrals were empty and there were no signs of livestock anywhere. "Apache?" Wade asked, studying the scene. Sana dismounted and began reading the signs scattered around the burned buildings. "No," she said after a few minutes. "White men did this. Boot prints shod horses, and look here." She pointed to something Wade had missed: bullet holes in what remained of the barn wall, grouped in patterns that suggested deliberate target practice rather than combat. "They killed for pleasure," Sana said grimly. "This was not war. This was murder." Wade felt his stomach clench as they found the first body, an older man, probably the rancher, shot multiple times and left beside what had been his front door. A woman's body lay near the well, and the smaller form of a child was barely visible in the ruins of the house itself. "Jesus Christ," Wade whispered. "The same men, perhaps," Sana suggested. "The scalp hunters." Wade shook his head. Different horses, different tracks, but the same kind of men. They buried the family in a grove of cottonwoods beside the creek, Wade saying words over the graves, while Sana stood silent witness. It was grim work, made worse by the knowledge that this scene was being repeated across the territory as various factions used the cover of war to settle personal scores or simply indulge in violence. "We cannot stay here," Sana said, as they finished the last grave. "No, but we can take what supplies they don't need anymore." It felt like grave robbing, but practicality demanded they gather what they could from the ruins. Canned food, ammunition, a better saddle for Sana's horse, the small necessities that might mean the difference between life and death on a long journey. They were loading the pack horse when Wade heard it, the distant but unmistakable sound of approaching riders. Multiple horses moving at a steady pace that suggested men who knew where they were going. "Hide the horses," Wade hissed, grabbing his rifle. They had just enough time to get the animals out of sight behind the burned barn when 6 riders emerged from the trees on the far side of the valley. Wade felt his blood freeze as he recognized the leader, a man he'd hoped never to see again. Sheriff Tate rode like he owned the territory, his badge catching the late afternoon light as he surveyed the destruction with obvious satisfaction. Behind him came 5 deputized civilians, the kind of men who wore badges when it suited them and ignored the law when it didn't. "Looks like someone beat us to it," one of the deputies called out. "Don't matter," Tate replied, dismounting near the fresh graves. "We wasn't coming for these folks anyway. We're hunting bigger game." Wade pressed himself flatter against the burned barn wall, his heart hammering. Tate had been the law in the nearest town when Wade first went into hiding 3 years ago. The sheriff was known for his willingness to bend rules and his particular hatred of army deserters. "You really think that deserter's headed this way?" another deputy asked. "Coulter hell, yes, he's coming this way. Got word from Apache scouts that he was seen with an Indian woman heading west. Man like that, he'll follow the easy routes, try to avoid settlements." Tate spat in the dust. "We'll catch him, and when we do, there'll be a nice reward waiting for us." Wade felt Sana's hand touch his arm, her eyes wide with understanding. They both knew what Tate's version of justice looked like: a quick trial, if there was a trial at all, followed by a hanging that would satisfy the territorial authorities and eliminate any inconvenient questions about the sheriff's methods. "What about the woman?" a third deputy asked. Tate's laugh was ugly. "What about her Apache woman traveling with a white deserter? She's probably his whore or his captive or both." Either way, ain't nobody going to ask hard questions about what happens to her. The casual dismissal of Sana's life and dignity made Wade's trigger finger itch. He had a clear shot at Tate from his position behind the barn, but taking it would mean a fight with 5 other armed men in open ground. Suicidal odds. The sheriff and his men spent another hour at the burned ranch watering their horses and discussing their plans for continuing the search. Wade caught enough of their conversation to understand that they intended to camp nearby and resume tracking in the morning. When the posse finally rode out to make camp in a grove about a quarter-mile downstream, Wade and Sana faced another impossible choice. They could try to slip away in darkness, but the sheriff's men would pick up their trail at first light. Or they could try to eliminate the threat entirely, but 6 armed men were odds that even Apache warriors would think twice about facing. "We could go around them," Sana suggested quietly. "Not with the tracks we've left. Tate's a good tracker and he's got men who know this country. If we run, they'll follow us all the way to California if necessary. Then what do you suggest?" Wade stared across the valley toward the sheriff's camp, his mind working through possibilities and consequences. Finally, an idea began to form, desperate and dangerous, but potentially their only chance. "What do you know about creating diversions?" he asked. "Apache raiders are taught many ways to confuse enemies. What did you have in mind?" Wade's plan was simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. While the posse slept, they would stampede the sheriff's horses, scatter the men, and use the confusion to eliminate the threat permanently. It required perfect timing, considerable luck, and a willingness to kill men who were technically upholders of the law. "These men," Sana said when Wade had explained his idea, "they are not true lawmen. They are killers who hide behind badges. That's how I see it too, but if we do this, there's no going back. We'll be wanted for murdering a sheriff and his deputies. We are already wanted. At least this way we choose our own fate." They waited until the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness was at its lowest ebb. The posse had posted a single guard who spent most of his time staring into their campfire rather than watching the surrounding darkness, exactly the kind of mistake that got men killed on the frontier. Sana moved like her Apache ancestors, flowing through the shadows until she was within striking distance of the picketed horses. Wade circled wide, positioning himself where he could command the camp with his rifle once the chaos began. The plan worked almost too well. Sana's sudden appearance among the horses, combined with the sharp crack of a breaking branch and her wild Apache war cry, sent the animals into screaming panic. They broke their picket lines and scattered in all directions, taking with them any chance the posse had of pursuit. The deputies stumbled from their blankets in confusion, most of them only half-dressed and fumbling for weapons. The guard, who should have been watching, was bowled over by a terrified horse and lay groaning in the dirt with what was probably a broken rib. Wade's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 men who were trying to organize a defense. Sana had produced her pistol and was adding to the mayhem with carefully placed shots that sent the survivors scrambling for inadequate cover. Sheriff Tate, to his credit, kept his head better than his men. He dove behind a fallen log and began returning fire with deadly accuracy, his bullets whining uncomfortably close to Wade's position. "Give it up, Coulter," Tate shouted between shots. "You're only making it worse for yourself." Wade's answer was another rifle shot that splintered wood inches from the sheriff's head. This wasn't about making deals or negotiating terms. This was about survival, pure and simple. The fight was brief but vicious. When the gun smoke cleared, Sheriff Tate and 4 of his deputies lay still in the gray dawn light. The 5th deputy, the one who'd been trampled by the horses, was alive but unconscious and clearly no threat to anyone. Wade and Sana spent precious minutes gathering what supplies they could from the dead men's packs, then set about the grim task of making their escape look like something other than premeditated murder. They scattered Apache arrows around the camp, left moccasin tracks in strategic locations, and generally tried to create the impression of an Indian attack. "Will anyone believe it?" Sana asked as they prepared to leave. "Maybe, probably not, but it might buy us some time before they organize a real manhunt." They caught 2 of the scattered horses and rode out of the valley as the sun was rising, leaving behind them a scene that would be talked about in frontier saloons for years to come. The story would grow in the telling, as such stories always did, until Sheriff Tate and his men became heroes who died fighting overwhelming odds rather than the brutal opportunists they had actually been. But Wade and Sana would be far away by then, riding toward a horizon that promised either freedom or destruction, depending on their luck and their willingness to keep fighting for the right to exist in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. As they climbed out of the valley and onto the high mesa that stretched toward the setting sun, Wade found himself thinking about the choice he'd made. There would be no going back now, no possibility of redemption in the eyes of civilized society. He was no longer just a deserter hiding in the wilderness. He was a killer of lawmen, a man beyond any hope of pardon or peace. But when he looked at Sana riding beside him, her dark hair streaming in the wind and her eyes fixed on the far mountains, Wade realized that some things were worth becoming an outlaw for. Some connections were worth any price society might demand. They rode toward an uncertain future, but they rode together, and for now that was enough. The mesa stretched endlessly before them, a wind-swept expanse of red rock and scattered sage that seemed to belong to no nation and acknowledge no law but its own. Wade found himself checking their back trail every few minutes, though he knew pursuit would be impossible until someone discovered the bodies in the valley below. Still, the habit of vigilance had kept him alive for 3 years, and he wasn't about to abandon it now. Sana rode with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, her injured ankle causing no apparent difficulty now that she didn't have to walk on it. But Wade could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon for threats that might emerge from any direction. "How far to the next water?" she asked, as they paused to rest the horses in the thin shade of a wind-carved rock formation. Wade consulted the rough map he'd drawn from memory and the stories of other travelers. "Maybe 15 miles. There's supposed to be a spring in a canyon system ahead, but I've never seen it myself." "Supposed to be." Sana's voice carried the skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust second-hand information about survival. "And if there is no spring, then we push on to the next possibility and hope our water holds out." They had filled every available container at the creek, where Sheriff Tate's posse had made their final camp, but desert travel was unforgiving. Water that seemed adequate for a day's ride could evaporate or be lost to accident, leaving travelers to face the agonizing choice between pushing forward and turning back. "Wade," Sana said quietly, as they remounted, "what we did back there, killing those men, does it trouble you?" The question had been haunting Wade since they'd ridden away from the Valley of Death. In his army days, killing had been part of duty, sanctioned by uniform and flag, and the chain of command that absolved individual soldiers of moral responsibility. But Sheriff Tate and his deputies, corrupt though they might have been, had worn badges that represented law and order in the territory. "It troubles me that it doesn't trouble me more," Wade admitted. "Those men would have killed us both without a second thought. Tate's kind of law isn't justice, it's just organized brutality." "In my tribe," Sana said, "we believe that some men choose to walk the path of evil. When they make that choice, they become something less than human. Killing such men is no different from killing a rabid wolf." "Is that how you see it? That Tate was like a rabid wolf?" Sana was quiet for a moment, her horse picking its way carefully across a stretch of loose shale. "I see it as choosing between their lives and ours, and I choose ours every time." The simple certainty in her voice was both comforting and unsettling. Wade had spent 3 years wrestling with guilt and self-recrimination, over his desertion, his failure to save Tommy, his inability to live up to the ideals he'd once believed in. But Sana seemed to have found a way to accept the harsh realities of their situation without drowning in moral complexity. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Live with the choices we have to make." "By remembering that the alternative to living with them is not living at all." Sana looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he was only beginning to understand. "You saved me from that snare, Wade. Everything since then has been a gift." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they crossed the heart of the mesa, turning the red rock into an oven that seemed to suck moisture from their bodies with every breath. Their horses began to show signs of distress, their heads hanging low and their steps becoming increasingly labored. It was Sana who spotted the telltale green smudge on the horizon that indicated vegetation and hopefully water. The canyon system Wade had marked on his mental map was real, a gash in the mesa's surface that promised respite from the brutal heat. The descent into the canyon was treacherous, requiring them to dismount and lead the horses down a narrow trail that switched back and forth across loose rock and crumbling ledges. But the effort was rewarded when they reached the canyon floor and found a genuine oasis, a spring-fed pool surrounded by cottonwoods and grass that looked like paradise after the sterile mesa above. "Thank God," Wade breathed as he knelt beside the water and cupped the sweet liquid to his lips, while the horses drank deeply and began cropping the grass with obvious relief. Wade and Sana refilled their water containers and took stock of their situation. They were perhaps 3 days ahead of any organized pursuit, assuming someone had already found the bodies and organized a tracking party. But 3 days could shrink to nothing if they made poor decisions about route and pace. "We should rest here until evening," Sana suggested. "Travel in the cool of night when the horses can handle the distance better." Wade nodded agreement, then began the practical tasks of setting up a cold camp. No fire despite the chill that would come with darkness. No unnecessary movement that might be spotted by distant eyes. Just rest, food, and the kind of quiet conversation that helped pass the time without revealing their position. As the sun sank toward the western rim of the canyon, painting the rock walls in shades of gold and crimson, Wade found himself studying Sana's profile in the dying light. Somewhere during their desperate flight, his feelings toward her had shifted from protective sympathy to something deeper and more complex. "What are you thinking about?" Sana asked, catching him staring. "You, if I'm being honest." Wade felt heat rise in his cheeks. "About how you ended up in that snare and what would have happened if I'd set my trap line somewhere else that day." "Fate," Sana said simply. "My grandmother would have said the spirits guided you to that place at that time because both of our paths needed to change direction." "You believe that in fate, I mean..." Sana considered the question, her fingers absently braiding a strand of grass as she thought. "I believe that some meetings are too significant to be mere chance. You could have left me in that trap, could have ignored my suffering. Instead, you chose compassion over safety, kindness over suspicion. That choice changed both of us." Wade wanted to argue that he'd simply done what any decent person would do, but he knew that wasn't true. Plenty of decent people would have walked away from an Apache woman caught in their trap, justifying their abandonment with references to ongoing warfare and racial hatred. His choice to help her had been just that, a choice made in defiance of everything his upbringing and military service had taught him. "Maybe your grandmother was right," he said finally. "Maybe we were supposed to find each other." Darkness fell across the canyon like a soft blanket, bringing with it the kind of deep quiet that existed only in places far from human habitation. Wade found himself acutely aware of Sana's presence beside him, the warmth of her body in the cooling air, the subtle scent of her hair and skin that spoke of sun and wind and the mysterious essence of life itself. "Sana," he said quietly, "there's something I need to say, and I'm not sure how to say it right." She turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the starlight. "Then say it wrong if you must. Truth spoken awkwardly is still truth. Wade took a deep breath, feeling like a schoolboy about to recite poetry for the first time. When I found you in that trap, I thought I was saving your life. But somewhere along the way, I realized you were saving mine too, not from bullets or pursuit, but from something worse, from becoming so hard and empty that I forgot what it meant to care about another person. Sana was quiet for so long that Wade began to worry he'd said too much, revealed feelings that weren't welcome or appropriate. But when she finally spoke, her voice was soft with emotion. In my tribe, there is a saying, the heart that has known great loss can also know great love because it understands the value of what it finds. My heart knew loss, Wade. My husband, my child, my place among my people. But with you, I am learning that loss can make room for something new, something precious. Wade felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for so long it had become part of his identity. What are you saying? I am saying that when I look at you, I do not see a white man or a soldier or a deserter. I see the man who cut the wire from my ankle with gentle hands, the man who shared his warmth and his food without asking for anything in return, the man who chose to risk everything rather than let others harm me. The space between them seemed to shrink, without either of them consciously moving. Wade could see the reflection of stars in Sana's dark eyes, could feel the soft whisper of her breath on his face. Sana, he whispered, and the name carried all the longing and uncertainty and hope that he couldn't find words for. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with feather-light gentleness. I have known only pain from men before you, fear and violence, and the kind of taking that leaves nothing behind but emptiness. But you have shown me that there can be giving, as well as taking, protection as well as conquest. When their lips met, it was with the tentative wonder of two people discovering something they hadn't dared hope for. The kiss was soft questioning, carrying within it all the acknowledgement of the impossible odds they faced, and the precious value of what they had found in each other. Wade felt years of isolation and self-recrimination beginning to dissolve in the warmth of Sana's acceptance. Here was someone who saw him not as a failed soldier or a coward, but as a man worthy of trust and affection, someone who had looked past the barriers of race and history and chosen to value the person he truly was. Are you sure about this? He asked when they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers. About us, because once we cross this line, there's no going back to being just traveling companions. Sana's smile was visible even in the darkness. Wade Coulter, we crossed that line the moment you decided I was worth saving. Everything since then has been two hearts learning to beat in harmony. They made love with the desperate tenderness of people who knew how fragile happiness could be, how quickly it could be torn away by forces beyond their control. Each touch was both claiming and worship, each whispered endearment, a small victory against the isolation that had defined their separate existences. Afterward, they lay wrapped in blankets and starlight, Sana's head on Wade's chest and his arms encircling her like a promise. The canyon walls rose around them like the sides of a cathedral, and for the first time in years, Wade felt something approaching peace. What happens now? Sana asked quietly. Now we keep running until we find a place where we can stop running. And if we never find such a place, Wade tightened his arms around her, then we'll have each other while we run. They traveled through the next 3 days and nights, like ghosts moving in darkness and resting during the heat of the day in whatever shade they could find. The landscape gradually changed as they moved west, the red rock giving way to different colors and formations, the sparse vegetation taking on new characteristics that spoke of different rainfall patterns and soil conditions. On the 4th morning, they saw smoke on the horizon, not the thin column of a campfire, but the steady gray streams that indicated permanent habitation, a settlement of some kind which meant both opportunity and danger. Could be a mining camp, Wade speculated as they studied the distant smoke from the concealment of a rocky outcrop, or maybe a way station for the freight lines. How many people do you think? Hard to say from this distance. Could be a dozen, could be 100. They debated the risks of making contact with other humans. Their supplies were running low, particularly ammunition and medical supplies. The horses needed proper rest and grain feeding if they were to continue the punishing pace of desert travel. But any settlement also meant the possibility of recognition of bounty hunters or territorial officials who might connect them to the growing list of crimes attributed to their passage. We could scout it first, Sana suggested. Watch for a while, see what kind of people they are. Good idea. If it's just miners or freighters, we might be able to trade for what we need without too many questions. They spent the better part of a day observing the settlement from various concealed positions. What they found was encouraging: a rough but apparently legitimate mining camp built around a creek that showed signs of recent placer activity. Perhaps 30 men, mostly Mexican and Anglo, with the kind of temporary structures that suggested a short-term operation rather than a permanent town. Looks safe enough, Wade concluded as evening approached. But we go in careful with stories ready and eyes open for trouble. They entered the camp as the sun was setting, 2 dust-covered travelers leading tired horses and looking like dozens of other wayfarers who passed through such places in search of opportunity or escape. Wade had coached Sana on their cover story. She was his wife, Mexican-born, fleeing family troubles in New Mexico territory. Her accent and appearance would pass casual inspection, especially in a camp where many of the miners were themselves Mexican. The camp's unofficial leader was a grizzled American named Peterson, who'd seen enough of frontier life to ask no unnecessary questions about a couple obviously traveling light and fast. He accepted Wade's story about heading for California at face value and was happy to trade supplies for some of the gold coins Wade had taken from Sheriff Tate's body. California's a good choice, Peterson observed as they concluded their business. Lots of opportunity out there for folks willing to work hard and mind their own affairs. That's what we're hoping for, Wade replied carefully. How far to the next settlement westward? Best part of a week, depending on how hard you push. There's a freight station at Willow Springs, then nothing much until you reach the real mining country in the Sierra foothills. As they prepared to leave the camp the next morning, Wade noticed Sana was unusually quiet. She responded to his questions with distracted nods and seemed lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. "What's wrong?" he asked when they were safely away from the camp and riding through the desert dawn. "That man, Peterson," she said slowly. "When he looked at me, I saw something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or suspicion." Wade felt his stomach clench. "You think he knew who you are?" "I do not know. But he looked at me the way men look when they are trying to remember where they have seen someone before." They pushed the horses harder that day, putting distance between themselves and the camp, while watching constantly for signs of pursuit. By evening they had seen nothing alarming, but the worry lingered like a shadow at the edge of consciousness. It was 2 days later, while they were resting in the shade of an overhanging rock formation, that they heard the sound that confirmed their worst fears: the distant but unmistakable rhythm of multiple horses moving at a steady pace across the desert. Wade scrambled up the rocky slope until he had a view of their back trail, and what he saw made his blood turn cold. At least 8 riders too far away to identify, but moving with the purposeful organization of a tracking party. "How far back?" Sana asked when he rejoined her. "Maybe 2 hours. Moving steady, not pushing their horses, but not wasting time either." "Peterson has to be. Probably sent word ahead when he recognized you, then organized a party to come after us." They broke camp immediately, pushing their tired horses toward the next possible refuge, a maze of canyons that Wade remembered from his mental map, a place where pursuit might be lost or at least slowed down. But their animals were exhausted from days of hard travel, while their pursuers rode fresh mounts and had the advantage of numbers. As the afternoon wore on, the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer. There, Sana pointed toward a narrow canyon that cut deep into a mesa ahead. If we can reach that, we might be able to find a place to make a stand. Wade nodded grimly. A stand was looking increasingly likely because their horses were beginning to falter. The pack animal was already limping, and Sana's mount was showing white around the eyes that indicated the kind of exhaustion that could lead to collapse. They reached the canyon mouth with perhaps 20 minutes to spare, plunging into the narrow passage just as the first of their pursuers appeared on the ridge behind them. The canyon walls rose on either side like the gates of some ancient fortress, offering both concealment and the possibility of ambush. "How far does this go?" Sana asked as they pushed deeper into the shadowy passage. "I don't know, but it has to go somewhere or else we're trapped like rats in a barrel." The canyon twisted and branched, offering multiple choices, but no clear indication of which path might lead to freedom. Wade chose what seemed like the main passage, praying that it wouldn't dead end in some impassable cliff face. Behind them, they could hear their pursuers entering the canyon, voices echoing off the stone walls as they organized their search. At least, they had the advantage of knowing which way their quarry had gone, while the hunters would have to divide their forces to check each branching passage. "There!" Sana's excited whisper drew Wade's attention to what she'd spotted, a narrow ledge running along one wall of the canyon, perhaps 30 feet above the floor. Not wide enough for horses, but possibly wide enough for people willing to take desperate chances. They abandoned the horses without regret. The animals were too exhausted to continue anyway, and might actually serve as decoys if their pursuers assumed the fugitives were still mounted. The climb to the ledge was terrifying, requiring them to trust their weight to handholds and footholds that crumbled at the slightest pressure. But desperation gave them strength and focus, and somehow they both made it to the narrow shelf of rock without falling to their deaths. The ledge ran for perhaps a quarter mile along the canyon wall before disappearing around a bend that blocked their view of what lay beyond. Moving along, it required absolute concentration. One careless step would mean a fatal plunge to the rocks below. They had covered perhaps half the distance when they heard shouts from the canyon floor behind them. Their pursuers had found the abandoned horses and were trying to determine where their quarry had gone. "Spread out!" Peterson's voice echoed off the canyon walls. They got to be somewhere close. Wade and Sana pressed themselves against the canyon wall, trying to become invisible against the red rock. From their elevated position, they could see the tracking party milling around their abandoned horses, several men pointing in different directions as they debated which way the fugitives might have gone. "Look up there," one of the trackers suddenly shouted. "On that ledge." A rifle cracked, and rock splinters showered down around Wade and Sana as the bullet struck the wall inches from Wade's head. More shots followed, forcing them to move despite the danger of the narrow footing. "Run!" Wade shouted, grabbing Sana's hand and pulling her along the ledge as fast as they dared move. Behind them, bullets whined and ricocheted off the canyon walls as the tracking party tried to bring down their targets. The range was long and the angle difficult, but it only took one lucky shot to end everything. The ledge curved around the bend in the canyon wall and suddenly opened onto something Wade had barely dared hope for, a natural bridge of stone that spanned the narrowest part of the canyon, connecting their ledge to another passage on the far side. "Can we make it across?" Sana asked, studying the stone bridge that looked solid, but was easily 50 feet above the canyon floor. "We have to try. It's that or get shot off this ledge." The natural bridge was wider than the ledge they'd been following, but crossing it felt like walking a tightrope stretched across the gates of hell. The stone was smooth from centuries of wind and weather, offering little traction, and the drop on either side was enough to kill them several times over. They made it across just as their pursuers rounded the bend behind them, rifles already raised and ready to fire. But the angle was even more difficult now, and the tracking party's shots went wide as Wade and Sana disappeared into the passage on the far side of the stone bridge. This new canyon was narrower than the one they'd left, its walls closing in until they were barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast. But it was leading upward toward what Wade hoped was the mesa top and freedom. After what felt like hours of climbing through the narrow passage, they finally emerged onto the mesa surface as the sun was setting behind the distant mountains. The tracking party was nowhere to be seen or heard. Apparently, the stone bridge had been too narrow for mounted pursuit, and the men were either trying to find another way around or had given up the chase. "Are we safe?" Sana asked as they caught their breath in the growing darkness. "For now. But Peterson knows we're headed for California, and word travels fast in country like this. We're going to have to be even more careful from here on." They had lost their horses, most of their supplies, and nearly their lives, but they were still together and still free. As they set off across the mesa under a canopy of stars, Wade found himself thinking about the irony of their situation. They had run from their respective pasts only to discover that the future held even greater dangers. But they faced those dangers together now, and that made all the difference. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever prices they would have to pay for the choices they'd made, they would meet them as partners bound by something stronger than law or custom, or the bitter divisions of a territory at war with itself. The night was cold and the path uncertain, but Wade Coulter had finally found something worth fighting for, not just Sana's life or even his own, but the right of two people to choose their own fate in a world that seemed determined to choose it for them. As they walked toward the distant glow on the western horizon that promised California and perhaps a new beginning, Wade realized that he was no longer running from something but toward it, toward the possibility of a life defined not by past failures or society's expectations, but by the simple truth that some connections transcend all boundaries. They were outlaws now beyond any hope of redemption in the eyes of civilized society. But they were outlaws together, and in the vast darkness of the western night, that was enough light to guide them home. The glow on the western horizon turned out to be more distant than it had appeared in the darkness, and by dawn, Wade and Sana were still walking across the seemingly endless mesa, their feet raw in boots never meant for such punishment. The desert sunrise painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. There, Sana pointed to a dark line cutting across the mesa ahead. Another canyon. Perhaps there is water. Wade squinted against the morning light, his eyes burning from exhaustion and grit. They had been walking for nearly 12 hours without rest, driven by the knowledge that Peterson's men might still be following, despite the obstacles they'd placed in their path. The canyon proved to be smaller than the labyrinth they'd escaped the previous day, but it held the precious gift they needed most, a thin stream of clear water running over smooth stones. They collapsed beside it like pilgrims reaching a shrine, drinking deeply and soaking their abused feet in the cooling flow. "We can't stay here long," Wade said, though every muscle in his body protested the thought of moving again. "I know, but perhaps an hour, the horses Peterson's men ride, they cannot cross that stone bridge. It will take them time to find another way around." Wade nodded, allowing himself to relax fractionally. An hour to rest, to plan, to prepare for whatever lay ahead. He pulled out the rough map he'd been keeping in his head and tried to calculate their position. If he was right, they were still at least 4 days from the freight station at Willow Springs, and that was assuming they could maintain a brutal pace across terrain that grew increasingly unforgiving with each mile. "Sana," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." She looked up from where she was examining a blister on her heel. "Ask. Are you sure about this? About us, about California, about running until we find a place where we can stop running, because if you want to turn back, if you want to try making peace with your people, no." The word came out flat and final. "There is no going back for me, Wade. Even if Nalnish forgave my refusal, Even if the elders decided my curse had been lifted, I could never return to what I was before. You have changed me too much. Changed you how? Sana was quiet for a moment, her fingers trailing in the stream as she searched for words. Before I met you, I believed I was worthless. Cursed, tainted, deserving of exile and suffering. But you treated me as if I had value, as if my life mattered. You cannot give someone that gift and then expect them to go back to believing they are nothing. Wade felt something tighten in his chest. You were never nothing, Sana. Never. I know that now, because of you. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold all the mysteries of the desert night. So do not ask me if I am sure about choosing you over everything else I have ever known. I am more sure of that than I have ever been of anything in my life. They resumed walking as the sun climbed toward its merciless noon zenith, following game trails and natural corridors that led generally westward. The landscape was changing again, becoming more varied as they approached the foothills of the mountain ranges that guarded California's eastern approaches. It was Sana who first noticed they were being followed. "Behind us," she said quietly as they paused in the shade of an overhanging rock formation. One rider, maybe two, staying back but keeping pace. Wade studied their back trail, his eyes searching for any sign of movement in the shimmering heat haze. At first he saw nothing, but then a glint of metal, probably a rifle barrel or belt buckle, caught the sunlight for just an instant before disappearing again. "Persistent bastards," he muttered. "What do we do?" Wade considered their options. They were on foot in open country, carrying limited supplies and no horses. Whoever was following them had all the advantages except one: they didn't know the terrain ahead any better than their quarry did. "We find a place to make a stand," Wade said grimly. "This running has to end somewhere, and it might as well be on ground of our choosing." They spent the afternoon working their way toward a cluster of wind-carved rock formations that offered the possibility of defensive positions. Behind them, their pursuers maintained their distance, professional enough not to close too quickly, but persistent enough to keep the pressure constant. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Wade and Sana found what they were looking for: a natural fortress of stone pillars and overhanging ledges that would force any attackers to approach from predictable directions while offering the defenders multiple escape routes. "How many do you think?" Sana asked as they checked their weapons and arranged what little ammunition they had remaining. "Hard to say. Could be Peterson himself with 1 or 2 men, could be a whole new tracking party. Either way, we're not running anymore." They didn't have long to wait. As the shadows lengthened across the desert floor, 2 riders emerged from the heat shimmer and began a careful approach toward the rock formations. Even at a distance, Wade could see they were moving with the caution of experienced manhunters. "That's not Peterson," Wade observed, studying the lead rider through a gap between 2 stone pillars. "Different build, different horse. Bounty hunters, perhaps. Most likely. Word's probably spread about the reward money by now." The 2 men dismounted well outside rifle range and began working their way forward, on foot, using every bit of available cover. Wade had to admire their professionalism. They moved like soldiers, coordinating their advance and covering each other's movements. "You in the rocks," one of them called when they were close enough to make conversation possible. "Name's Hanley. I'm here to talk." Wade and Sana exchanged glances. Talking was usually a prelude to negotiation, but negotiation required something both sides wanted to trade. "Talk about what?" Wade called back. "About the price on your heads, about the easy way versus the hard way. What's the easy way? You come out peaceful like hands empty. The woman comes back with us, you get a quick trial instead of a bullet." Wade felt anger flare in his chest. Even now, with all their cards on the table, these men assumed Sana was property to be returned rather than a person with her own choice to make. "And the hard way," Wade shouted. "We kill you where you stand and take her anyway." Sana's hand found Wade's arm. "Do not let them take me alive," she whispered. "Promise me that." It won't come to that. Promise me, Wade. I have heard too many stories of what bounty hunters do to Apache women before they collect their rewards. Wade met her eyes and saw a fear there that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with the kinds of suffering that made death seem merciful. I promise, but it won't come to that because we're not giving up. He raised his voice to carry across the intervening distance. Here's our counteroffer, Hanley. You ride away now and we let you live. Harsh laughter echoed off the rock formations. That's real funny, friend, but you're outnumbered and outgunned. Last chance to do this the easy way. Wade's answer was a carefully aimed rifle shot that spanged off the rock inches from where Hanley had taken cover. The sound echoed like thunder in the enclosed space between the stone pillars. Hard way it is, Hanley shouted, and the shooting began in earnest. The bounty hunters were good at their trade, but they were facing opponents who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Wade's rifle spoke with mechanical precision, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down while Sana worked her way to a flanking position with the spare pistol. The battle was brief but vicious. Hanley's partner made the mistake of exposing himself while trying to get a better angle on Wade's position, and Sana's carefully placed shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the stone. Hanley himself was made of sterner stuff. He used his wounded partner as a distraction, circling wide around the rock formations while Wade was focused on the more obvious threat. It was only Sana's sharp eyes that spotted the flanking movement in time. Wade, behind you. Wade spun just as Hanley emerged from cover, rifle already trained on his target. Time seemed to slow as both men fired simultaneously, muzzle flashes lighting up the gathering dusk like deadly fireworks. Hanley's shot went wide, spoiled by haste and the treacherous footing among the rocks. Wade's bullet found its mark, taking the bounty hunter center mass and dropping him beside his wounded partner. The silence that followed the gunfire seemed unnatural after the violent crescendo of combat. Wade moved carefully among the rocks, rifle ready, making sure both attackers were no longer a threat. Hanley was dead, his eyes staring sightlessly at the darkening sky. His partner was still breathing, but unconscious, blood seeping from the shoulder wound. What do we do with him? Sana asked, indicating the wounded man. Wade considered the question. The man was clearly dying. The bullet had nicked an artery, and blood was pooling beneath his body, despite Sana's shot being aimed to wound rather than kill. They could try to help him, but medical supplies were limited, and the effort would cost them precious time. More practically, letting him live meant he could eventually report their location and direction to other pursuers. But murdering a helpless man, even an enemy, was a line Wade wasn't sure he was ready to cross. We take what we need and leave him, Wade decided. If he lives, maybe he'll reconsider his choice of profession. They gathered the bounty hunters' supplies and weapons, then caught their horses and prepared to continue the journey in darkness. The wounded man stirred as they were loading the pack animal, his eyes focusing on Wade with difficulty. You're making a mistake, he whispered. There's others coming, lots of them. Words out from here to California about the reward money. How much? Wade asked, curious despite himself. 500 for you, dead or alive. The man's voice was growing weaker. 1,000 for the Apache woman, alive only. Wade felt his blood chill. Those were substantial bounties, enough to attract every manhunter and desperate outlaw in the territory. Someone with serious resources wanted them caught and wanted Sana alive for reason that probably had nothing to do with justice. Who's paying? Wade demanded. But the bounty hunter's eyes had already closed, and his breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. Whether he lived or died, he wouldn't be answering any more questions. They rode through the night, pushing the stolen horses hard across terrain that seemed designed to break both animals and riders. The knowledge that substantial bounties had been posted on their heads added urgency to their flight. Every settlement, every isolated ranch, every chance encounter now represented potential betrayal and capture. $1,000, Sana said quietly as they paused to rest the horses in a dry creek bed. That is more money than most men see in a year. More than enough to make every desperate man in 3 territories willing to risk his life for a chance at capturing you. Wade studied her face in the starlight, seeing the worry there despite her attempt to appear calm. Any idea who might be willing to pay that kind of money? Naalnish has wealthy relatives, men who trade with the Mexicans and have accumulated gold and silver. If he convinced them that his honor demanded my return, $1,000 is a lot of honor. Apache men have killed for less when their pride was at stake. Dawn found them in foothills country, the flat desert mesa giving way to rolling hills covered with scrub oak and manzanita. The change in terrain offered both advantages and disadvantages, more cover and water, but also more places for ambushes and more chance of encountering other travelers. They were following a game trail through a narrow valley when Wade spotted something that made his heart sink, smoke rising from the direction they needed to travel, and lots of it. Not the single column of a campfire or even a small settlement, but the multiple streams that indicated a substantial gathering of people. Roadblock, Wade said grimly. They climbed to higher ground and studied the source of the smoke through Wade's small spyglass. What they saw was both better and worse than expected. Not an organized military checkpoint, but a temporary camp that had sprung up around a natural water source. Perhaps 30 men and twice as many horses, all gathered with the obvious purpose of controlling passage through this particular valley. Bounty hunters, Sana observed, studying the camp's haphazard organization. Has to be. Probably figured this is the most likely route for anyone heading toward California, so they're camping here until we show up. Can we go around? Wade studied the terrain with growing dismay. The valley they were in was the most practical route through this section of the foothills, flanked on both sides by steep ridges that would add days to their journey, days they might not have considering the resources being marshaled against them. Maybe. But it'll cost us time we don't have, and there's no guarantee they haven't posted watchers on the alternate routes. Then what do you suggest? Wade lowered the spyglass and looked at Sana with an expression she'd learned to recognize, the look of a man preparing to take desperate chances. I suggest we go through them instead of around them. Through 30 armed men, Wade, that is suicide. Not through the camp itself. But camps like that, they get careless about security, especially at night. Too many men, too much confidence, too much drinking around the campfires. Wade's plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would wait until the deepest part of the night, then infiltrate the camp and create enough chaos to cover their escape. It required perfect timing, considerable luck, and a willingness to kill anyone who got in their way. It could work, Sana admitted after he'd explained the details. But if we're caught, we die fighting instead of swinging from a rope. I can live with those odds. They spent the day hidden in a grove of live oaks, watching the camp and learning its rhythms. As Wade had predicted, security was casual, a few posted guards, but nothing like the systematic vigilance that might have stopped a determined infiltrator. Most of the bounty hunters seemed to view the assignment as easy money camping in comfort while they waited for their quarry to walk into their trap. They had no reason to expect Wade and Sana to attempt anything as crazy as a direct assault on their position. As darkness fell, Wade and Sana made their final preparations. Extra ammunition, water, food that could be eaten on the move. They would have one chance at this, and failure meant death or worse. Ready? Wade asked as they prepared to move. Sana checked her weapons one final time, then looked at him with those dark eyes that held all the trust and love he'd never dared hope to find. I am ready to follow you anywhere, Wade Coulter, even into hell itself. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, using every skill their desperate circumstances had taught them. The camp was laid out around the water source with horses picketed on the perimeter and men sleeping around scattered fires. Wade had identified the key targets during their day of observation: the horses that could be stampeded to create confusion, the ammunition supplies that would burn spectacularly if ignited, the guard positions that would need to be eliminated silently. It began with Sana's infiltration of the horse lines. She moved among the animals like a whisper of wind, cutting picket ropes and creating strategic gaps in the perimeter. The horses, sensing her presence but not identifying her as a threat, remained calm despite their newfound freedom. Wade's part was more violent. The guards on the camp's eastern perimeter had to be eliminated quickly and quietly before they could raise an alarm. His knife did the work his rifle couldn't, opening throats in the darkness with the efficiency he'd learned in army raids against Apache camps. The irony wasn't lost on him. Skills learned fighting Apache were now being used to protect an Apache woman from his own people. The chaos began when Wade reached the camp's ammunition supplies and began spreading gunpowder in carefully planned lines, leading back toward the darkness. The fuses were crude but effective strips of cloth soaked in coal oil that would burn slowly enough to give him time to escape. He was lighting the first fuse when everything went wrong. A bounty hunter stumbled out of his bedroll to relieve himself and spotted Wade crouched over the ammunition boxes. The man's shout of alarm echoed across the camp just as the first explosion lit up the night. "Attack! We're under attack!" The camp erupted into chaos as men scrambled for weapons while trying to understand what was happening. The exploding ammunition sent bullets whining in all directions, making everyone dive for cover rather than organize an effective response. Sana chose that moment to trigger the horse stampede, firing her pistol into the air and shouting Apache war cries that sent the terrified animals thundering through the camp. 30 horses, moving at full gallop, could trample anything in their path, and the bounty hunters found themselves caught between exploding ammunition and a wall of horsehide and steel hooves. Wade fought his way through the chaos, using the confusion to eliminate targets of opportunity while working toward the rendezvous point where he'd arranged to meet Sana. Bodies littered the ground around the ruined camp, some trampled by horses, others cut down by their own ricocheting ammunition, still others killed by Wade's rifle as he carved a path through the madness. He found Sana at the edge of the camp, mounted on one of the horses she'd managed to catch during the stampede. She had a second horse ready for him, and they rode out of the valley, while the surviving bounty hunters were still trying to understand what had hit them. Behind them, fires burned where the ammunition had scattered its deadly contents, and the screams of wounded men echoed off the hills. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. The roadblock had been eliminated, and their path to California lay open. "How many do you think survived?" Sana asked, as they put distance between themselves and the destroyed camp. "Enough to spread word that we're not the easy targets they thought we were," Wade replied grimly. "But that's good and bad. Good because it might make others think twice about coming after us. Bad because it'll make the ones who do come more careful and better prepared." They rode hard through the remainder of the night, finally stopping as dawn broke over a landscape that looked subtly different from the territory they'd been crossing. The vegetation was changing, becoming more lush, and the air carried scents that spoke of greater rainfall and different seasons. "California?" Sana asked, testing the word. Wade consulted his mental map and the position of the rising sun. Close, maybe another day's ride to the real California country. But even as he spoke the words, Wade wondered what they would find there. California might be far from Arizona territory, but it wasn't beyond the reach of determined bounty hunters or territorial marshals. The prices on their heads would follow them anywhere civilized law extended its reach. "What if California is not the sanctuary we hope for?" Sana asked, echoing his own thoughts. Wade studied the horizon, where purple mountains rose like ramparts against the morning sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay the Pacific Ocean, and beyond that nothing but water stretching to the edge of the world. "Then we keep going until we find a place that is," he said simply. But privately, Wade was beginning to understand something that changed everything. about their situation. They weren't just running toward California or any other geographical destination. They were running toward the idea of home itself, the possibility that two people who had lost everything could create something new together. And perhaps that was the real destination they'd been seeking all along. Not a place on any map, but a state of being where the past couldn't reach them and the future belonged entirely to the choices they made together. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces and casting long shadows across the California-bound trail. Whatever lay ahead, more bounty hunters, territorial marshals, or simply the everyday challenges of building a life in wild country, Wade and Sana would face it as they had faced everything since that morning when he'd found her caught in his snare. Together, bound by something stronger than law or custom, or the bitter divisions of a world at war with itself. Partners in the most dangerous game of all, the simple radical act of choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over everything else the world had to offer. They rode toward the rising sun and the promise of California, two hearts beating in harmony against the vast silence of the American West.